start, and I usually record for those who can't make it. If you don't want to be visible, erase your screen, but it's nice to see you all. And as I was saying, thanks for taking the time at such a busy moment in the semester. I know we're all busy grading exams and examining students, so I appreciate you taking the time to welcome actually this new project that I'm excited to introduce, a project on gendered mimesis. And I won't call it a sister project to the Homo Mimeticus, because that would be setting up a binary that is really not one. Play a little bit with that. And new team members, Giulia Rignano, who will be our PhD student for this project, and Willow Verkerk, who will be giving a lecture in a moment, and I'll be introducing in a moment. But I just wanted to take just a few minutes to frame a little bit this new project, which is, as I said, it's not at all a sister project, because there is gender already at play in the Homo Mimeticus. Nikki is working on Irigare at the moment. But it's a supplement or a complement to the Homo Mimeticus, in the sense that it specifically deals with the relationship between gender and mimesis, and that is not the main focus of Homo Mimeticus. Though what the two projects have in common is the fact that they put pressure on the notion of mimesis, understood as a relational, affective, embodied property, in order to decenter autonomous notions of subjectivity as self-contained and monadic. And I think that this is a fundamental connection to both the Homo Mimeticus and the Gender Mimesis project. So we are basically pushing for the same mimetic turn, just from different perspectives. And I should say, on a very personal note, it's for me a pleasure and a personal satisfaction to have a project on feminism and gender mimesis for different reasons. But the obvious one is because it is still badly underrepresented at the Institute of Philosophy, but not only. It's difficult to find classes that are specifically dealing with feminist philosophy. And in general, it's still very much a patriarchal world. And I should say, we had to push Willow and I to get this project going, and not once, not twice, not 3 times, not 4 times, and we kept pushing and joining forces, just to tell you how difficult it is to get these projects accepted. And I'm saying this because I know that this is the moment in which we get feedback from FWOs and other projects, and very often you might be disappointed. And perseverance, I think, if I've learned something over the years, is what is needed. So don't give up, keep reapplying, because it takes time to get these projects accepted. And I should say, even with this project on gender mimesis, both Willow and I thought we had something quite solid at the level, or the fundamental conceptual level. There was a near C grant for leverage, so that's not nothing. And there was already collaborations ongoing with the primary authors themselves. Okay, publications with Caballero forthcoming, and still 4 or 5 rejections. Now, in a world in which it's not saturated by feminist philosophy, if there is oversaturation with feminist philosophy, then, okay, there are so many projects on feminism that there is no space, so it would be understandable. But I'm saying this to say, okay, it's an uphill battle. When I say uphill, it's because I feel it in my legs. So I share this with you. Then personal for me, because I should say, and that's something that I don't emphasize very often, but since the Homo Mimeticus project is coming to an end, or last year, I feel like sharing more the personal motivations behind my interest in this notion of mimesis. You know that I've been working on figures like Girard, Lacoulabach, Bataille, Nietzsche, and these figures that are very often seen as patriarchal, though I think that if one reads them closely, they have very often a very feminine side in the writing, very maternal figures. But that's not the point. The point is that I started thinking about mimesis via feminist figures like Irigaray and via critical race. That was my starting point. When I was gravitating towards theories of identity that were questioning a certain dominant notion of the masculine autonomous subject, that's where I found my starting point. So my second MA was on Irigaray, and my first MA was on Toni Morrison, who is an African-American writer. And the reason I say this, it's because it's partially my fault, and maybe partially the fault of the Belgian weather that does something to my skin in the winter. But I've been confronted quite repeatedly with the fact of, basically being blamed that I don't do enough for feminism, and which is true. There is not enough being done. But I would like to acknowledge that that's actually my starting point. If you look at my publications early on, they're all about female African-American figures. And diversity is obviously central to my way of thinking. I wouldn't be here with an ERC grant, would I come from a position that is not, let's say, embedded in diversity. And it should be visible, but apparently it's not. So that's why I need to say this. Lawtoo from Switzerland, yes. Then more conceptually, in my first book, The Phantom of the Ego, I developed two concepts that might be useful for the gender mimesis project as well. And that is the one of mimetic sexism and mimetic racism. I noticed persistently in the 19th century, but not only, this tendency to project qualities that pertain to a mimetic subject, a subject that is open, that is embodied, that is affective, that might be dispossessed, to project these qualities onto racial or gendered others. And I thought it's a pattern that mimesis is excluded. It's projected onto the others, but at the same time, it can also serve as a mirror to the dominant subject of Aufklärung that destabilizes that position of autonomy. And so I've been using those concepts, mimetic racism and mimetic sexism, in order to begin to deconstruct this autonomous subject. And interestingly, if you think in terms of the vertical hierarchies that still very much organize thought, like at the level of dichotomies, let's say mind, body, high, low, spirit, matter, verticality, horizontality, stable plastic, and so on, you find that both mimesis and gender are often on the side of the inferior side of the binary. And otherness in general, not only gender, so that the copy original distinction overlaps in very direct terms with the male, female, white, black binary. And so that's why I say Homo mimeticus and gender mimesis are directly related. And at the level of strategies, what we've been doing in the Homo mimeticus could be, say, a double strategy, which I think might be useful for the gender mimesis project as well. One of them consists in destabilizing the binary, as I already said. Figures like Judith Butler will point out that there is an original gender just because there is the copy, so that the original is engendered through the reproduction, and that mimicry makes the original possible. It's something that is there in Irigaray as well, and that destabilizes that ontology, that underscores the copy original distinction. But the second entry, and that's one where the Homo mimeticus has been mostly invested in, is that the notion of mimesis emphasizes an embodied, affective, and above all, relational subject. It's about relations and embodied and affective relations. And so here I think that figures like Malabou and Adriana Caballero, who are at the center of the Gender Mimesis project, can provide important supplements in order to do more work on that front. It's something that we started in the Homo Mimeticus project. I've written about Malabou and the plasticity of mimesis, and with Caballero, as I mentioned, there is a publication that, let me see if I can share it, that is forthcoming with SUNY University Press, that is titled Thinking Italian Women, and it will be out in September. And there we have a dialogue that we titled Mimetic Inclinations. That's what I was alluding to before, and here is the link. The book is not out yet, but it will be out in September. And so what I want to emphasize is that what is important there, it's a certain relational conception of the subject that is at play, I think, in Butler, in Malabou, in Caballero, but not always explicitly under the rubric of mimesis. Could be inclinations, could be plasticity, could be performativity, but not mimesis itself. And Willow will say more about that in a moment. But I just wanted to say that that's part of the strategy of the Homo Mimeticus project as well, is that there are authors who are deeply engaging with mimesis, but might not use the concept, because the concept might be still tied too closely to the tradition that they're up against, to the metaphysical tradition that they deconstruct. So the strategy here consists in bringing a different notion of mimesis, which is embodied, affective, and so forth, relational, to bear, so that new genealogical connections can be established and new perspectives can be opened up, because there is a lot to be gained. I think we've seen repeatedly also with the Posthuman Mimesis Conference in establishing that or inscribing a given line of thought in that long genealogy of thinking that is tied to mimesis. So I won't say more about it, but I just want to share two announcements, which I think many of you have seen already, but maybe not all of you. We are already planning a workshop in November with Adriana Caballero, and the call for paper went up a couple of weeks ago. If you are interested, do submit an abstract. It's due at the end of August, I think. And I just share it in the chat as well. And then there is a position opening up for a postdoc, a 20% postdoc, ideally for somebody who is already in Leuven, since it's only a 20% position. So if you are yourself interested or know of someone who would be interested in applying, ideally, we are looking for somebody who can help us organize the workshop on Caballero. So interest in Caballero would be welcome, and so don't hesitate to circulate the information. So you find the links over there. But good, so without further ado, let me introduce Willow Verkerk. You've met her already. Willow is in a way returning to Leuven. She did her PhD here at Leuven some years ago on Nietzsche. And since then, her book appeared, a book on Nietzsche and friendship that appeared with Bloomsbury in 2019, which I highly recommend. It's a beautiful book on an account of friendship in Nietzsche, which is an overlooked aspect of Nietzsche's thought. And Willow does an excellent job in bringing it out, how friendship is crucial to thinking, and Nietzsche thinking in particular. And Willow is a philosophy instructor at the University of British Columbia. So she got up very early this morning just to talk to us and to give us an introduction about the three main figures that will be at the center of the Gender Mimesis project: Adriana Caballero, Catherine Malabou, and Judith Butler. So Willow, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Nadesh. I'm very happy to be here. this morning, my morning, your afternoon, and there might be people in different time zones, to introduce you to the project. So just give me a moment here to get my PowerPoint up and I'll share my screen. Hold on. Okay, share screen. Is everyone able to see that?
Yes,
now?
it works well.
Great. So today what I want to do then is provide you with an introduction to the Gendered Mimesis project. And the way I'm going to proceed with this is to start off by generally talking to you about the project, some of the objectives, as well as some of the concerns I think that really structure the project. And then I want to go into a short theoretical introduction and start off with a very general account of mimesis, taking from Plato and Aristotle, and then discussing Adriana Cavarero, Judith Butler, and Catherine Malabou's notions of inclination, the performative, and plasticity, and link them to different aspects of mimesis in order to explain how I believe they continue to work with this ancient concept. So I think the first question that for me really structures this project is the following. How can we understand gender identity today in relation to the changing landscape of gendered and sexual differences? And what the Gendered Mimesis project proposes is a return to the subject through a rethinking of mimetic theory in continental feminist and queer philosophy. So we've seen that there is a growing body of trans, intersex, non-binary, and queer literature on gender identity, both in popular culture and in academia. I think we are now aware that philosophies of sexual difference cannot be strictly categorized in binary male and female oppositions. Yet, in philosophy especially, but I think in academia largely, we still work with this default gender of a male subject. And this is why I think, and someone like Cavarero would argue, we still require a feminist critique of sexual difference. So what this project wants to do, I think, is to try to understand the growing tension between the dominant and emerging models of subject formation. And in order to do so, we propose that a philosophical literary account, which can respond to both, is required. So what this project does in broad strokes then is proposes that the concepts of performativity, plasticity, and inclination provide really an illuminating focus to reframe the questions of gender identity in mimetic terms that are sensitive to contemporary conditions. So these are the three thinkers that the project concentrates on. At the top, Adriana Cavarero with her notion of inclination, Judith Butler with their notion of performativity, and Catherine Malabou with her notion of plasticity. Of course, we'll bring other thinkers into the discourse, and especially important, I think, today is someone like Sarah Ahmed, who talks about the intersections between racialization and sexualization. So there are really three guiding objectives of the Gendered Mimesis project. And the first one is the one I'll concentrate on today. And I think it's the objective that structures the theoretical foundation of the project. And it is to develop a new theory of the gendered subject based on the mimetic accounts of gender identity outlined by Butler, Malabou, and Cavarero. Then the second objective is to critique the modern subject of Aufklärung for its uncritical beliefs in the sovereign individual and disinterested reason, and promoting an androcentric, cisgender, and Eurocentric version of the human. Third is to test and refine this new hypothesis of gendered mimesis with what I call dissonant exemplars or non-conforming characters drawn from case studies from literary history. Now, this could go in a number of directions, depending on perhaps Julia's research or the other postdoctoral research, but myself, I've already worked with some non-conforming characters not necessarily in modern literature, but someone like Antigone is an example. Another one would be the Marquis de Sade-Juliet. The project is looking at someone like Orlando from Virginia Woolf, and there's other examples as well. So there are two shortcomings that the Gendered Mimesis project is concerned with when it comes to formulating a philosophical notion of the subject. And the first shortcoming that the project takes aim at is what has been termed, at least in this project, the rationalistic Kantian approach, which is something I've already spoken about, having too strong of an idea in the sovereign subject, which does not account adequately for affect, relationality, and really for how material, embodied, and aesthetic conditions shape human lives. But the other shortcoming is one perhaps that I think is a new concern that I've seen come up, especially in trans and queer literature, is a critique of the Butlerian performative approach, that this is too one-sided. There's too much of an emphasis on subjection to discursive forces, a la Foucault, which ignore biological elements. So both these two accounts do not sufficiently consider how natality and relational narratives coming out of Cavarero's work and trauma and brain injury coming out of Malibu's work form and transform identity. So these are two really important additions, I think, coming from Cavarero and Malibu that will respond to these shortcomings. So of course, the project is working with this primary assumption that identity is mimetic, which means, in simple terms, instead of human identity being defined by the capacity for reason or autonomy or some adherence to the moral law, we find in Cavarero, Butler, and Malibu effective accounts of the subject in which identity formation is mimetic. In other words, we are formed through a complex process of behavioral imitation. So I'm going to proceed now in 4 parts. First, I'm going to provide a kind of initial working definition of mimesis by referring to Plato and Aristotle. Next, I'm going to turn to Cavarero's notion of inclination and her critique of representation to provide a kind of preliminary framework for rethinking the ontological, psychic, and ethical foundations of contemporary identity. Next, I'm going to look to Butler's concept of the performative and their notion of subjectivation, which you really see most of all in the Psychic Life of Power, one of their early texts, which I think is very interesting, and look at the kind of working definition of the mimetic subject on gender, which I think we see most clearly in Butler's work. And then I'll conclude by very briefly looking at Malibu's notion of plasticity and how it might work together with inclination and the performative to build a new account of the gendered subject. So let's start off by reviewing an old concept that many of you probably even know more about than me, which is this notion of mimesis. So if we look to the Oxford English Dictionary, the way that mimesis is described there is the action, practice, or art of mimicking or closely imitating the manner, gesture, speech, or mode of action in persons or the superficial characteristics of a thing. But of course, we know that mimesis is more than this. So it involves behavioral imitation, of course, copying, mimicking, miming, or attempting to resemble some person, idea, thing. But it also involves impersonation and expression, how the act of imitation is enacted, absorbed, and expressed. And it also involves contagion, which Nadesh has written about in a fascinating way in his most recent text. So certain qualities such as anger, pity, laughter, which when imitated become contagious. Of course, we have many accounts of this when it comes to discussing tragedy. And I think this is also very important for gender in terms of the psychic way that we attach ourselves to gender. So we know that mimesis is more than imitation. This image is from the National Theatre in London, a remaking of Antigone, and perhaps Antigone is one of the pieces of theater remade more than any other classical works, but this is a great example of how mimesis operates, right? That it involves not just miming or imitation, but is always engaged in a kind of dialectical interaction in which the person who is imitating is interpreting the script, but they are also modified by it. And in terms, they are modifying the script in their enactment of it. So I want to move on now and just review some of the classical notions of mimesis, which I will then connect to Butler and Cavarero and to Malibu a little bit. And I think we're very familiar with this, but perhaps there's some people who aren't. So we see Plato talk about mimesis in Ion and in books 2, 3, and 10 of the Republic. And of course, we know that his critique of mimesis is related to his ideal metaphysics, right? To this realm of the ideal forms, such as the beautiful or the good. Often when we teach Plato's forms, we talk about the ideal form of the triangle, but there's also this notion in his philosophy as there being something that is perfectly beautiful, right? And so the problem with mimesis, according to Plato, is that it is far removed from this ideal world. And so Plato has a kind of hierarchy, right? I think this is an easy way of thinking about it. Of course, at the top, there is the ideal world, the world of the forms. And then there is the phenomenal world, the world of being in which we exist. And then below this is the world of representation, for example, where the poet writes their tragedy, where a story is told. Then we have imitation, where the actor performs the tragedy. And then out of imitation comes impersonation and contagion. For example, where the spectator is affected by and then spreads the story to others. So this is kind of the hierarchical notion that's operative in Plato. And so Plato has particular concerns, right, about the dangers of tragedy. And so what he says is that the poet writes in the third person and the actor performs in the first. And what happens is there is a meaning or world created from that poem. But the emotions and the messages of the fiction become part of the psychological life of not only the actor, but also the spectators. And this has the potential to create alternative and new meanings. And the problem with this, of course, is that these alternative meanings may perpetuate falsities and be in contradiction to the truths of the ideal world. So the danger then for Plato is that people experience these alternative meanings or worlds too many times during their lifetime. If their emotional life is shaped by these fictions, they may begin to over-identify with them, turning to them instead of being shaped by the truth. So I think what Plato points out and what's really interesting about him is that mimesis is about creating. So it's not only about imitation, it's also about making. And the threat of art, poetry, narrative is that it creates a new meaning. And this makes the human prone to hubris, to excessive pride, to creating new worlds, which should be solely the role of the gods. And what does Aristotle have to say about mimesis in short terms? Well, we can look to his Poetics and the Nicomachean Ethics for this. He says that we learn through mimesis, and it is a natural experience which forms us from an early age. So Aristotle doesn't have such a critical approach to mimesis in the way that Plato does. He says that children learn language and form their character through imitating the behaviors and characteristics of others. We imitate because we learn and grow by imitation. And for humans, Aristotle writes, learning is both natural and a delight. When it comes to tragedy, we see more advanced forms of mimesis emerge so that imitation gives way to representation and depiction, which exceeds mimicry and copying. And so what we have in these tragedies and in these stories are universal themes that are explored in order to enlighten the audience. And so Aristotle writes, tragedy is learning, that is figuring out what each thing is. And so tragedy teaches us about ourselves and can provide us with philosophical insights that support both intellectual and emotional development. So we have this notion of tragedy and mimesis as operative through tragedy as something that educates us and is integral to our self-understanding. And I'm going to bring this now to Cavarero, who I think is also working with mimesis through lines which are both Platonic and Aristotelian, But one thing I'm going to take up today is this idea that mimesis does educate us. And this is why representation matters so much. And this is connected to what Cavallaro is going to say on inclination. I'm going to be focusing on this text of hers, Inclination and Critique of Rectitude. And what Cavallaro says in this text is that inclination has an educative role to return to a notion of the human that reflects the phenomenal world more accurately. And representations of the human form in history and the history of European philosophy and art and literature are problematic because they tend to prioritize the upright male figure over the inclined female one. And so one of the goals of this text outlined by Cavallaro is to move away from the Kantian model of what she calls egocentric verticality and towards a relational and vulnerable model inspired by the infant-mother relationship. And she writes, instead of continuing to fragment the subject, one could try drawing on Arendt to incline it. So in this text, Cavallaro is rethinking representation and critiquing the way that representation works to shape our ideas of what it means to be human. And one thing that she takes up is this aesthetics of vertical masculinity. And she gives several really interesting examples of how this functions. One that she discusses is this artwork by Barnett Newman, which she says is a kind of representation of the patriarchal symbolic order. And what she says about this is that the use of lines and colors in these two paintings are symptoms of our celebration of verticality and its alignment with masculinity. Whereas Eve is represented in a solid red void with a thin black line at the edge, Adam is marked by strong red lines on a blackish background, lines which would reach up to God. And Cavallaro compares this to different images of inclined maternity. And one example that she gives is from Roshenko's Stairs, in which we say a representation of maternity in which a woman carries a child and bag of groceries up the stairs. And what Cavallaro says is that we see here is the child depending on the inclination of the mother. And Cavallaro's argument is that maternity exceeds the stereotype of self-sacrifice and should be more properly understood as the strength of relationality. So she's introducing us to new forms of representation, which she believes are necessary for providing a kind of more complete notion of the human subject. And she turns to this really beautiful image by Gentileschi of the allegory of inclination to build her philosophical notion of inclination. And in this image, we see a young woman holding a compass leaning towards a small star, which Cavallaro says represents the irresistible pull of artistic talent. Here, Cavallaro says inclination is given a positive attribution, as is the case in stories of creation in which the collision of particles through inclined movement bring forth life. So inclination is really at the heart of creativity, life, and maternity. Yet we have overlooked maternity in the history of ideas and aesthetics. And Cavallaro argues this has prevented us from coming to know the human subject in terms of its full potential for relationality. Yet, as she proves, we are not without limits. So Cavallaro is proposing this maternal model of the subject as an alternative to the patriarchal symbolic order in order to provide us with new representations which can then affect our consciousness. But what she asks is, how is that we have reduced the mother, a robust figure of relationality, to one of care? And she says, well, this has not just occurred in classical works of philosophy and art, it's also happened in feminist philosophy and even in thinkers like Arendt. And to respond adequately, Cavallaro claims, to the self-enclosed verticality of the Kantian subject, we require an ethical subject whose primary state of being is relationality. And she says the infant or the event of natality that Arendt talks about is not sufficient. The infant is dependent and vulnerable. It cannot fight back if it is harmed. The mother, on the other hand, is a figure of responsibility who responds to this vulnerability. And Cavarero calls the mother the ethical actor par excellence. And so the question is, of course, I think this is an old question, do we need a feminine metaphysics? And I'd say Cavarero is suggesting we do. And one question for us to ask today in relation to this tension between, do we need to concentrate on sexual difference or the proliferation of genders? Well, of course, we need to talk about both, but are we getting a more egalitarian metaphysics from Cavarero's account? So as we know, she's proposing that maternity and inclination have been effaced by the patriarchal symbolic order, which champions models of rectitude. And she's claiming we need this feminine model based on the mother. Now, I believe philosophy would benefit from taking up Cavarero's subjective inclination because, the post-Enlightenment subject certainly needs to be dislodged from its commitment to an androcentric subject. But we need to go further than this. And the next step is to consider how the notion of maternity can include all genders and location, but in a way that does not make invisible the feminine. So, for example, Cavarero does not really adequately address questions of maternity that exceed the heteronormative cisgender relation, and at least as far as I'm aware, but perhaps other people can correct me. But this is especially why I think someone like Judith Butler is so important and why we need the concept of the performative when talking about gendered mimesis. So now I'm going to say a few words about Butler's notions of subjectivation. Their development of the notion of the performative, where it comes from, I think is very influenced by Foucault and by Nietzsche. And you see this probably most of all in the Psychic Life of Power, where drawing on Foucault, Butler says that the subject is constituted by its subjection to institutionalized power and the narratives associated with it. In other words, any agency that the subject has arises out of its own subjection. One is then both activated and formed by that power that subjects them. So Butler's account of the subject, as a Hegelian, of course, involves a dialectical movement between the subject and narrative of the ideological power that shapes it. And as I've noted, it's from Discipline and Punish, Foucault's text, that Butler is very influenced. So what about Butler's Foucauldian notion of becoming the subject? What does Butler say about this? Well, they say that normalization occurs through subjectivation when the body gains significance through various bodily regimes. One is compelled to mimic these idealized behaviors. And so the soul is constituted by the mechanisms of power that work over the body. Even though the subject is shaped by disciplinary powers, the various processes of the shaping offer up discourses from which those disciplinary powers can be modified. So arguably, and this is something that I think Rosie Berardotti has noted, Butler's notion of Foucauldian subject involves a lot more agency than Foucault himself would have allowed. So this is how Butler comes to this notion that gender is performative. And in Gender Trouble, they write, I quote, "Acts, gestures, and desire produce the effects of an internal core or substance, but produce this on the surface of the body, though the play of signifying absences that suggest but never reveal the organizing principle of identity as cause." So these acts, gestures, and desires are performative because they are enacting an essence that in fact is not there. It is merely an imitation of an ideal narrative that has been imposed upon the body. So what Butler claims is that genders have no truth other than the kind of truth within a discourse which creates the fantasy of a primary and stable identity. So this has been one of the concerns, for example, of someone like Julia Serrano, who wrote The Whipping Girl, in some trans literature, is that the biological elements of gendered being are effaced by the kind of queer theory initiated by Butler. And I think this is something that Malibu brings back through her notion of consciousness and the brain and a phenomenal being situated in the brain, that we return to an idea of embodied being, which isn't just solely discursive in the way that Butler seems to say it is. But I think very important for understanding gender is Butler's account of naturalized heterosexuality and how it is mimetically formed. And they talk about the heterosexual matrix, and you can kind of see this image on the right here. So, you know, Butler was very influenced by Freud in this idea that, Freud's idea that there's only the drive. And they use this to build this notion that there is no necessary necessary linear correlation between sex, gender, sexual orientation, and sexual practices. So it's not necessarily the case that one who is born a female will identify as a woman, will have a heterosexual orientation, and will move towards procreative sex. So what Butler did is showed that these things are not necessarily the case, and in doing so, they denaturalize heterosexuality and are very critical of the kind of binary gender system, which presupposes a causal relationship between sex, gender, and desire. Very important for the politics of liberation in the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans movement. So I think one thing that is especially interesting about what Butler says is, can be formulated in the following way, that gender is a kind of mimetic force, right? And so what Butler says about gender is that it's a strategy. And this is just as Foucault calls the powers that exercise themselves on the body as strategy and discipline and punish, which aims towards the cultural survival of a heteronormative world. So gender as a discourse impresses itself on the subject. We over-identify with the heterosexual hegemony of gendered being, just as the spectator can be seen to over-identify with the fictitious story of the poet, right? One of Plato's concerns. What this tells us is that gender is not a site of stable identity. It is instead an ongoing performance and negotiation between the doing of the subject and the stories of the world. So Butler is very inspired by Nietzsche's saying from the genealogy of morals, there is no doer, there is only the deed. So gender is a mimetic force, one which has a contagious narrative, one might say, attached to our emotions and the validations and invalidations of others. So how do we take these concepts of Cavarero, Butler, and Malibu to build a new concept of gender mimesis? And I think these are really preliminary notions, but the way I'm coming at this is using Cavarero to rethink representation through inclination. So what Cavarero does is she explains how the narrative about identity and its representations can be changed by looking to resources that are ready at hand, works of art and literature, birth and maternity, and the body. So she's filling out our notion of the human subject to one that includes the feminine, right? And then I think what Butler gives us is a way to redefine the imitation component of mimesis through her notion of the performative. There is a truth discourse about gender, identity is formed there, but it can also be resisted and reformed through mimetic reinterpretations of the gendered myths. And then what I think Malibu can do, and this is, I haven't worked it out, there's a lot more work to be done, but I think Malibu can help us to explain the process of impersonation through a notion of plasticity. Because what Malibu says is that the human being is formed through experience, but they can also be broken by it. The self is materially formed and reformed through the interpretations and responses the subject has to their own trauma, which means trauma experienced through memories, brain damage, and life experience shape identity and can have harmful as well as liberating effects. So no doubt, the working through of the concept of mimesis in relation to impersonation, which enriches the poverty of the performative approach, I think it's the most challenging aspect of this project and the one that I haven't worked through yet. What does Malibu say about plasticity? Well, She says that plasticity means that the psyche can receive form in the way that clay does, give form the way a sculptor or surgeon does, but also explode as does a plastic explosive does and cause destruction. So this is about trauma. And what she writes is, I quote, "When brain damage creates a new identity, this creation can be only created through the destruction of form." So here we have her notion of destructive plasticity. So what I think inclination, the performative, and plasticity can do is that they can provide the foundation for a new articulation of gender identity, which first resists the meta-narrative of the androcentric cisgender subject and provides a more realistic and relevant account of the subject, which considers both internal and external forces as determining factors of contemporary identity. And so, in simple terms, what I want to do is use inclination to rethink representation, the performative to redefine imitation, and plasticity to explain impersonation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Willow, for this beautiful presentation. Wonderful. And you've given an account of the three authors behind this background of mimetic theories that are indeed already at play in the Homo Mimeticus project, but that you're taking, and the Gender Mimesis project is taking in new directions, exciting and timely directions, via three figures that have never been compared before. So there is also that dimension of establishing dialogues, and as you showed, complementing each figure's limitation through the others. Excellent. So I think we have plenty of time for discussion, for questions, for clarifications, and this is, as Willow said, kind of a general outline of a beginning of a project. It will continue over the years, but I think Willow did an excellent job in mapping the main ligne de force of the project. So do you have any questions also with respect to the texts? So Willow shared the introduction to inclinations, very short sections of what should we do with our brain, and then the conclusion of Gender Trouble, which was nice to reread, by the way, because some of these texts, especially Gender Trouble, I remember reading it in graduate school, and so it's good to go back to these texts.
Don't be shy.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Of course.
Thank you, Willow, for your really very wonderful talk. Very interesting. I was thinking about this relation between, on the one hand, the importance of, let's say, affirmative, creative, and positive representations of the feminine, on the one hand, that you take from Cavadero, and then this Butlerian sort of deeply ingrained mimetic structures of gender, right? And the powers behind it that are just beyond the self or out of reach always. And I was wondering, like, how the two relate, in the sense that from a feminist perspective, how do you make people inclined towards these representations, or a restructuring of these deeply ingrained let's say enactments of gender that are so deeply in you that you don't notice them, right? So it's also a matter of like how okay, we're plastic. Okay, it means that these performative acts are not definite. They don't determine my identity. Yeah, how do these representations suddenly become a moment of resistance, or that you realize even that it is representing something deeply or fundamentally different than what we are used to. So for example, the woman or the mother with the child on the stairs, like it is because you told me, right, about the fact that this is a different way of thinking about motherhood, and that it might be a different paradigm to think about individuality, but it is because you told me. So like, I don't know, I just wonder, like, does this require some sort of particular context or education, or how do we become inclined to see these shifts in representation, and how I as a person respond to it? It's maybe a bit of a messy question, but I hope you understand what I was trying to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nikki. And yeah, Nadesh, feel free to jump in too. But you know, I see what you're pointing to, and I connect this to Nadesh's introduction when he said there was a lot of resistance to getting this project funded. And it's something that's well documented in research and in feminist research, is that there is resistance towards a feminist discourse. And that's something that, you know, is related to the patriarchal order of things, which is very strong in philosophy. So how do you teach or open people up to considering new representations? Well, one step in academia is to have research like this funded and to gather more people to talk about it and to have greater visibility. I mean, that's what representation is about, and on all different levels, right? Is to support and encourage and to act in collectives. I think also it has to happen at the level of institutional activism. But the more people talk about a problem and give it visibility, and the more interested it is, it becomes contagious, right? Quite mimetically. So I think that this is the first step. And when it comes to the individual, I almost feel like this is more of a topic for psychoanalysis. Like, how do you allow yourself to rethink your gendered identity or your habits when it comes to your gendered being? Well, definitely reading feminist and queer theory is a way in which you start to self-question your gender, your own gender performatives, and your adherence to particular norms of, for example, institutionalized heterosexuality or cisgender norms, et cetera. And I think there's already quite a lot of uptake in popular culture now. So people are being pulled towards thinking about these problems in a way that just wasn't possible, say 10 years ago. I mean, a really simple and maybe silly example is, I think of when I was growing up, there was just so few representations of female heroes on television or in film. Now they're everywhere. Turn on Netflix. There's like female, people of color, queer people doing amazing things as villains and heroes. So opening up representation in all different forms of life, I think is important. And it is happening, and it's exciting. Philosophy seems to be lagging behind a bit, but maybe we're getting a bit better. Do you want to add to that, Nadesh?
No, yes, I fully agree. I think also this figures like Caballero, I have the pleasure to meet her, and we became quite close in the sense that we have conversations, and she is modest. She's a modest thinker, and she likes to remind me, we don't count that much. Non contiamo niente. So thinkers who have the vision of thought, she started with Plato as a Plato scholar, and has seen the slow transformations, work stubbornly with that very long tradition, establishing new connections, establishing new links, and hoping that this will indeed inspire new generations of philosophers, which they are. So maybe Caballero, I say, well, you count quite a bit, so I have to come back and balance. And so one of the advantages, I think, of having a project on living authors, on authors who are alive, is that we can engage with their thought. And also what I was saying at the beginning, like Mimesis is not really central to Inclination, the book. She talks about representations, indeed, but she doesn't use the concept of mimesis explicitly, but Caballero uses related concepts, like the one of dispossession. She speaks of forces that piega l'io e lo dispossessa, bends the ego and dispossess it. And I know she's thinking of Ion. And so, for instance, in this interview that we did, I pushed her to say, okay, what about if we think about mimesis not in terms of representation, but in terms of the chain of Ion, the magnetic chain, which indeed has an affective impact on the rhapsode that dispossesses the rhapsode. And so by establishing those links in this long chain of thinkers that starts way back, and opening up mimesis to new ways of thinking that we are discussing, for instance, now, I think that you have a possibility to change tradition in the long run. And by having a project like the one that we have and establishes this link, speaking about impersonation in Malibu and mimicry in Butler, to open up ways of thinking that are relational and also practices of teaching, I think, that go along with it. I think one of the important lessons that come from the Platonic tradition is the importance of education and how we teach and who we teach, right? And so the fact that we are here talking about 3 female philosophers is not nothing. And the fact that the project is predominantly animated by young researchers that are engaging with these thinkers, I think it will shape subsequent thinkers. And so in the long run, even though we count little, I think we are making a small indents. But I saw that Ortwin had a question.
Not so much a question, Nidesh. I'm sharing my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
And this is just to back up what's being said about philosophy and gender. You can see the real outlier here. So red is female and blue is male. And this is the proportion of male to female PhD students at KU Leuven. And then you see that philosophy is scandalously underrepresented in terms of female participation. Psychology, overrepresented, if that's the right word. Theology also underrepresented, but that's to do with the fact of priests not being able to be female mainly. But this is the problem, right? That needs to be addressed, and I'm very happy that this project is here now and will help us to address that problem. The only question I had was in the beginning, Willow, you referred to the intention to move beyond the androcentric, cisgender, and so forth perspective, but you also mentioned Eurocentric there. But then you're stuck with basically still 3 weird people, so white, educated, industrialized background, rich, and from democratic contexts. Was there not an opportunity, or will there be an opportunity to engage with Asian feminist thinking, with African feminist thinking? That's just an open question.
Yeah, that's an important question, and it's highly relevant, and I think the project does. But I think due to the kind of brevity of the space I had to talk about in the kind of preliminary introduction, I did focus on these 3 main thinkers, but certainly there needs to be thinkers included from the global South, or at least, I have thought, or I do plan on talking about Sarah Ahmed again. Sarah Ahmed is working in queer and philosophy and talking a lot about racialization, but is not from the global South. So I hear your point, and I take it as extremely important. It does get challenging sometimes when you're trying to work through thinking something like gendered mimesis. How do you give adequate account of that and also bring racialization into the discourse and the global South into the discourse? So there is a challenge when it comes to intersectionality. How do I do justice philosophically to one concept and fully consider all the other kind of, class is also an important element that is not brought up adequately there. So yeah, certainly these are valid points and should ideally be addressed, I think. Yeah. And I also appreciate you sharing that chart. I think that was great to see. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and thanks, Ortwin, for showing us the numbers, because they do matter and they do speak, right? So with the clarity of a concept. And just to follow up on what Willow is saying, indeed. So for instance, in the workshop that we are planning with Caballero, we are planning to give space, for instance, to dialogue with critical race theory. And we hope to have submissions that open up the discussion. And also for Julia, she will be working on the PhD, and she already expressed the desire to engage with racial difference as well. And so indeed, why these three figures? It's always a bit tricky, and we thought, yeah, for the internal philosophical cohesion of the project, it helped to have thinkers that come out of the same tradition, even though they're not, aligned exactly with the same genealogies. Like Arendt is the main figure behind Caballero, then there is Foucault behind Butler and Derrida behind Malabou, even though these figures are plural and there is more than one. So, but they do already belong to a certain diversity within continental philosophy. And my desire would be to have a project on racial mimesis, of course. So devoted to that specifically. So just give me time and we'll follow up.
Can I jump in?
Go ahead, Laura.
Yes, thanks. I was wondering if you're also going to look at the precursors of these second or third wave feminist thinkers, and if you're going to try to trace the genealogy of concepts like inclination beyond Arendt and maybe back to Virginia Woolf, for instance, because you already mentioned that you're probably going to be working on Orlando. But I was thinking, so when I read the piece on inclination, it brought back to mind a passage from A Room of One's Own about the straight bar of the eye. And I went back and looked at it. And what's interesting is that it's just next to the passage where she discusses androgyny. And what she says, so this is after she reviews most of the great female writers up to herself. And then she says, indeed, it was delightful to read a man's writing again. It was so direct, so straightforward after the writing of women. It indicated such freedom of mind, such liberty of person, such confidence in himself. And then later on, she says, but after reading a chapter or two, a shadow seemed to lie across the page. It was a straight dark bar, a shadow shaped something like the letter I. One began dodging this way and that to catch a glimpse of the landscape behind it, and so on and so forth. So I think that the idea of inclination, the idea of this egocentric construction of the subject is already in a nutshell there in Woolf's thought, although she doesn't articulate it in a rigorous philosophical way. So I was wondering if there's room for this kind of connections in the project, but I don't know, like maybe you're more interested in linking up to thinkers that follow Butler and Caballero rather than anticipate them. So I was just curious about this.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thanks for bringing that up, Laura. I think we are very interested in the genealogy of these concepts. This is part of what the project's about, and it's especially linked to the second objective of the project that I outlined in my introduction when we talk about challenging, questioning the subject of Aufklärung. And certainly Caballero uses Woolf to do this when she plays with this notion of the I, and there's a chapter in Inclinations where she writes explicitly about that. So certainly the literary and philosophical genealogy of the upright human subject, the subject of rectitude, and how it's portrayed and exemplified in different texts and in philosophy, because this project is about the intersections between literary theory, aesthetics, and philosophy, right? I think is very important and interesting. And there's definitely work to be done there. And I see that as part of the project. So. Okay.
And then just as a follow-up on the discussion on Butler, I was wondering if you know, I'm going to post it in the chat. There's a recent interview that Owen Jones did with Butler about trans issues. sometime in January, I think it came out.
Mhm.
And she basically revisits gender trouble and discusses it from the perspective of trans rights and the recent developments, and puts it into perspective from her current point of view.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, Butler has also said that they identify as like non-binary, so their pronouns are they and she, which is, so she is fine, right? But that is, I always knew Butler also as, I don't even know if it's proper to call Butler a feminist because they're more queer, and gender trouble is highly critical of feminist theory, although, okay, they're in the feminist literature, right? But that would be an interesting piece to read. I haven't read it yet, and I would like to, because I think, as I noted, there is quite a heavy criticism of Butler from trans authors. So it would be good to read that article and see how Butler responds to them. There's also the book 2014, I think it's called Undoing Gender, that Butler wrote, which is specifically about transgender identity. And one of the issues that the trans community, academic community has with Butler is, of course, that this dismissal of biological elements, because hormones end up being so important to identity, but also the way that Butler writes about drag, right? So Butler uses the example of drag to talk about the fluidity of gender. And perhaps this is something that Butler addresses in this piece, but it made it seem as if gender was just a choice. Anyone can choose to be whatever they want, just take it on and take it off. And, you know, of course, people who experience their gender different than what is embodied say that this is not something they choose. It's something that is like integral to their sense of identity. So this notion of gender as drag is problematized because it makes it seem too casual and not this deep lived experience, right? So, yeah.
Yes, this makes perfect sense. Yeah, they do address this in the interview. It's just a YouTube oral interview, so it's not a written piece, and it's not like thoroughly philosophical in the highbrow sense, but it does address exactly these issues. So you might find it interesting. And sorry for mistaking the pronoun. Yeah, I completely
I think
forgot.
she and they is fine both. Yeah, from what I understand. Yeah, thank you for that. We'll check it out.
And by the way, Laura, have a look at chapter 3 of Inclinations, which is specifically devoted to Virginia Woolf and specifically to the eye, the shape of the eye.
Yeah, thanks. You caught me. I will look at that.
It's short and it's a nice read. And yeah, maybe following up also on what Willow was saying, this strategy of pairing thinkers that complement and supplement each other. Indeed, the performative theory of gender emerged in the 80s, 90s. Gender trouble, I think, is 1990s, and I read it early on, and that's why I was saying it was interesting to reread it, because we are in the 30 years later, and it's difficult to ignore the biological component of subjectivity, and that's something that Malabou indeed picks up with brain plasticity. And so using these figures, you know, also to supplement each other is I think a viable strategy. And well, from my perspective, one of the critiques that I would have to maybe both Malabou and Butler, not Cavarero, because she's critical of it, but is the reliance, quite heavy reliance on psychoanalysis as a strong model of the psyche, and for that maybe the genealogies of Homo mimeticus come in useful, because for instance Butler relies on in the psychic life of trouble of power. Psychic life of power, it's both Nietzsche, Freud, Althusser, these are the main figures. But she reads Nietzsche along Freud, this account of internalization in the genealogy of morals. And it works for that simply because Freud, that is not very known, discussed the genealogy of morals. Freud claimed not to have read Nietzsche because he was afraid to be influenced by Nietzsche. But I've done research on that, and genealogy of morals was discussed within the psychoanalytical circle chaired by Freud for 3 sessions or so. So, you know, that's the influence is direct with Nietzsche. but also I think a Nietzschean tradition brings in alternative models of the unconscious that are not necessarily based on the repressive hypothesis, or don't give that much attention to trauma, but are relational, because the unconscious is something that happens in between subjects, in relation. So models like hypnosis and suggestion and this rapport between self and other, I think could be useful to bring in dialogue with the psychoanalytical background that informs Malabou and Butler, also because of their attention to mimesis specifically, because of and mimesis as a relational force that happens in between subjects. So that's something that we can discuss later on. But that doesn't mean because we rely on these three figures that we have to stick to their theories, but we can supplement their notion of mimesis from alternative perspective as well.
There's one question that I brought up during my presentation. I don't know, Nadesh or Julia, or if anyone else would want to respond to it, whether you see it a problem in terms of the way that Cavallero discusses maternity as being a new model of the human subject. And she still seems to take a very binary approach to gender, right? Which is quite classical, and it's something Irigaray also does, building off, this comes out of the psychoanalytic tradition to some degree, right? This binary notion of sexual difference. But Freud also opens up, because of his notion of the drive, and this is something that Butler works with, a notion of sexuality that isn't as binary. And I see this as one of the advantages of psychoanalysis. But do you see it as a problem, this notion of maternity? Is it something that only those people embodied as women can experience, or do you think Cavallero is willing to extend maternity to caretakers and to people who aren't embodied women or not? How do we work with that? That's one of the questions I have, at least.
Julia, you want to start?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about all the attention that both Cavallero and Butler are putting on the concept of vulnerability, which in fact is something that I think has helped Cavallero to pass from a bigger vulgate of the philosophy of difference, of course, later on in the 90s, when the queer theory has been more into the context of academia. And seeing now both these authors coming together in front of a kind of urgence to talk about not a kind of identity, but on a kind of quality of an identity, which is the vulnerability of the subject. And this brings the attention to, yes, something that Deleuze and Guattari called the minoritarian subject, which is can be gendered, can be racialized, can be indigenous, can be a whole things that are vulnerable towards something that is kind of not registered into the main tradition of thought. So this is something that needs to come back as something that cannot be missed out. But both Cavallero and Butler are, I think, well, together in this try to give care, not a female address, to give maternity not a biological sense, or to think of vulnerability as something that needs to be in line with victimization. I don't know if this is the English word, but I mean, to give vulnerability and the minoritarian sense of subject, a new sense. So.
Indeed, I think following up on what Julia is saying, and then Marina as a point or a question, I think that's where the genealogy, I think, is useful, because my sense is that Cavallero's emphasis on maternity, it's because she takes the notion of natality in the newborn from Arendt, who is there, develops it embryonically and expands it and gives it body. let's talk about the mother. It's not only a newborn, there is no newborn without a mother. And indeed, she confesses she's coming out of a Catholic tradition. And so these figures of the Virgin and so forth do play a role in the representations that she discusses. But I think that she's more than willing to extend the notion of care to the notion of the minor that Julia is bringing up. The caregiver doesn't need to be a mother. I think she says that in the interview I did with her. I'm not sure, but we'll have to double check. Marina.
Yes, so thank you for your excellent presentation. It was very enriching. So in relation to all these interventions, I was thinking, for example, that Virginia Woolf is a classical precursor of feminism of difference. And commenting on Nietzsche too, as we all know here, I'm sure, Nietzsche is widely read in feminism of difference because he wants to drag difference out of the curse, as Deleuze said. And that is the line of research that I think is really the contribution of feminism of difference within this project, I think. Because I think that feminism of difference usually answers that it is not that qualities like maternity are biologically intrinsic to women, but that historically they have been linked to women, and that is why we have to revalue them. And I think that it's also the point of genealogy, because, for example, I have not read Caballero as much, but Luisa Muraru, Carla Lonzi, etc., Lucy Garay. And Luisa Muraru, for example, is very critical with the use of genealogies in feminism, because she thinks that they are used with the goal of comparing us to men, to show that we can be as great as men, that we can be female scientists, female artists, etc. And that the point is not that. The point is to produce women's thought, for example, and to think of us independently of men. And I think that is the power of feminism of difference, and that combined with Butler, as you will say, and performativity, that is a very powerful contribution. And I think also that I was thinking before in relation to this dispossession character of gender. This is argued by Irigaray. Irigaray, I think it's in Je tu nu. She says that she uses sex instead of gender because she wants to speak about the subject of enunciation instead of the object of the discourse, which is the women. And I think that that is also related to the answers that Butler has given to those who have objected her to a voluntarist point of view. What we were saying before, that gender is something that we take out of the closet this morning. Today I'm this gender, tomorrow this other one. And that identity, since Hegel and Fichte and Hegel, is something that is negotiated, as we were saying before. And Butler is Hegelian. And I think that she carries this point very well when she says that many times gender is not how we see ourselves, it's how we are seen. And so those were all my thoughts on all the things that were discussed. I'm sorry it took so long. And thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Marina. I thought those were many interesting comments and observations. And I think that there is a tension here. And I really like the way, Julia, you talked about this notion of minority and how you built on that in Dash. But I still think bringing up Irigaray, you know, I had the opportunity to meet her when I organized a conference with her in 2016. And I had some really, one in particular, lovely lunch with her where I had the chance to ask her a lot of questions. And someone like her, embodiment is important. I mean, if you think about Speculum of the Other Women and some of her classical texts, she says, you know, women have two lips. She talks really about the vagina. You know, she's very concerned with physical embodiment. and the female experience of giving birth, right? So you do have this legacy in feminist thinking, and especially in European continental feminist thinking, in which embodiment matters. And interestingly enough, this is something that's come back, especially relevant for trans feminine literature, is that yes, embodiment matters. That's why I need to be embodied as a woman, right? So there's also this emphasis on the actual experience of physical embodiment, which is something that someone like Butler in the kind of social constructionist theories of the 90s tried to get away from, the metaphysics of substance, that embodiment is irrelevant to gender, but we're coming back to this idea that actually embodiment matters, sex matters. And this is something that Irigaray is emphatic about, right?
I see that Philip has a question. I think it's Philip.
No, it's 5, but yes, thank you. So one of the things that's, my wife posted that link from the interview that we talk about sometimes, and so I have to be careful what space I'm in when I say this, but the turf problem, trans issues are being hindered by the fact that we can't even talk about the well-being of trans men, it seems, until we're done dealing with the consequences of trans exclusionary radical feminism, regardless of what any given person thinks of that. The idea being that trans women get identified with male power through their bodies. And my gut instinct is that this entails that it's almost like we can't talk about the power aspect of Butler's thought on performativity. Once a trans woman is identified with male power, like the talk can't continue, and then both parties operate in, I hate this, in victim mode, forgive my language, instead of as collaborators. And this is this problem that like makes me cower in trans spaces. And is there something encouraging? We've talked about how maybe Butler misses some parts of the problem. Is there something encouraging or optimistic in there? Or is this just a thinker that they're very good for the cause, but it's not really. I just feel like we're passing over their value. And is there something that, given the contemporary context, you think we could bring out again?
Okay, I think I'm going to try and respond. Thanks for that. What I hear you bringing up is something we see in popular culture and in some universities, which is a kind of political struggle between the trans exclusionary radical feminists who are often identify or coming out of the tradition of the old school separatism radical feminists who believe, who, for example, coming out of Andrea Dworkin, although people have said Andrea Dworkin was trans positive, this idea that women need to separate themselves from men in order to overcome the patriarchy. So that's this, the trans exclusionary feminists are transphobic, right? They don't believe that trans women are real women, for example. And then you have the fight from the trans perspective, which says we are, let us determine ourselves. And of course, there's a political struggle between these two groups. Now, I don't think that this academic project necessarily wants to enter into that conversation. But one thing I would say, and maybe Nadesh and Julia can add to this, is that I think bringing together people like Cavarero, Butler, and Malibu, they're going to give an idea of gendered mimesis, which is not exclusionary. And that's why I find them interesting. because we have in Cavareiro an emphasis on maternity and the necessity of bringing back, in a sense, a feminine metaphysics to our understanding of the human being. Then we have in Butler this notion of the performative and gender being related to a heterosexualist hegemony and also a cisgender hegemony, which excludes certain types of people. And then we have Malibu saying, okay, neuroplasticity is so important, and we have to consider the brain as consciousness, which has been very important for ideas of gender when it comes to hormonal variation and such. So I think bringing these people together, for example, with Cavareiro, who emphasizes natality and relational being, and Malibu, who emphasizes biological elements and the neuroscience, provides this fuller account of gender, which is not going to support the kind of exclusionary politics that you're bringing up. So that's one of the things I really like about bringing them together. And of course, as was pointed out, we also need some account of racialization and location. And Sarah Ahmed's book, Queer Phenomenology, is excellent. It works with Fanon, and it talks a lot about the taking up of space and the perceptual experience of sexualization, queer identity, and racialization. And I think that could come into the project and bring phenomenology into the project in an interesting way. So I think these theories are able to overcome some of the more linear perspectives on gendered being, which would support kind of exclusionary politics. But of course, academia is doing something theoretical, which doesn't insert itself in the same kind of struggle that you're bringing up. So that's kind of how I would respond to that. I don't know, Nadesh or Julia, if you want to add anything.
No, not specifically. I think you addressed it very clearly. And I think, yes, we are operating on a different level. And these figures are indeed inclusionary thinkers and pluralist thinkers. So that's why we're engaging with them. And we look forward to opening up more intersectional collaborations, starting with the conference or earlier already in the next semester. But I think it was wonderful to have us started already this semester, since the project officially started. Julia and Willow are working on it, and we will be joining forces for the next year with the Homo Mimeticus project. We still have to decide whether we want to have two separate seminars, how we're going to organize the meeting specifically, but I think that there is a lot to be gained for both Gender Mimesis and Homo Mimeticus to be joining forces in order to promote this mimetic turn in feminist philosophy, which is already underway. So as Willow showed. I don't want to keep you too long. I have MA thesis left to grade for tomorrow as well. And I know many of you are grading exams and thesis as well. So, and you, Willow, you have a long day in front of you still. So I wish you all a good summer. I will see maybe some of you still, but if I don't see you, take time to disconnect. I think we were reminded of the importance of the body and remaining inclined physically towards others in real relations. Now that the vaccine is coming along, I think that we need that kind of connectivity, and this project speaks to it specifically. So I think it gained a new resonance during the corona crisis. We didn't talk about it, but the fact that the gender issues and issues of violence against women and transgender people emerged during the pandemic crisis with such brutality shows that this is indeed a project that is timely and that will allow us to continue the discussion. So thanks very much, Willow, and thank you all for joining. I wish you a great summer, and we'll resume, I think, end of August, beginning of September, but we'll remain in touch, of course. So have a great summer.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the questions and interesting discussion.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.